Hello and welcome to another ClimateTech podcast, conversations with the people trying to save us from ourselves. In this episode, I spoke with Melina Sánchez Montañez, Investment Principal and VP of Impact at AENU. We talked about why traditional venture capital is broken, why carbon isn't the only metric that matters for the climate, and the problem with climate rose. I'm Ryan Grant Little. Thanks for being here. Melina, it's so great to see you again. Welcome to the podcast.
Happy to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
So can you tell us a little bit about your background? When I think when we first met, you were working in impact investing, but in kind of a different space. And now you're fully dedicated to the climate tech space. What brought you to investing in climate tech today?
Yeah, it's a little bit of a long story, but I guess we have time. I actually started my career in government more than 10 years ago as a diplomat working for the Spanish and European governments in Latin America and in other geographies. And I pretty soon realized that as much as I had this public mindset and social impact mindset, that was not the right environment for me, too slow, too bureaucratic. And so I switched 180 degrees and ended up at a B2B SaaS fintech startup in New York after college, which was an amazing learning school. We were helping hedge funds and institutional investors optimize their portfolios around attribution, exposure, basis points. And it was amazing to be at the core of, I guess, Wall Street and grow with my clients. But in the grand scheme of things, I didn't really feel connected to the job. I didn't feel fulfilled, and I was missing that social impact work that I had done in the past. So I decided to pivot again, and that's how I discovered the whole field of impact investing years ago in the US. And at first, I didn't even know there were so many types of impact investing strategies, right? All the way from venture philanthropy and donation, all the way to venture capital. And I found out pretty quickly that my sweet spot was in impact venture capital, both because it really honed on my skill set from my time in Wall Street, but also because I needed that fast-paced, innovative workflow. And that's what I did for the last years. It's true that when we met, I was actually in the more venture philanthropy side of things. So I did that for a couple of years, both with social business and also at a foundation here in Germany. But I was always missing, the more return profile expectations of venture capital. And that's how I found my way to, again, climate venture capital.
And you're in Berlin right now. There's a lot of stuff happening in climate tech, both on the investment and the entrepreneurship side. Is it buzzing there? Is a lot of stuff happening? I haven't been to Berlin in about a year, but I keep seeing new things popping up. Is there a buzz there?
No, absolutely. I would say Berlin, Germany is one of the hotspots for climate startups and for climate venture capital. I think that in the last couple of years alone, we had 4, 5, 6 or more climate venture capital funds popping up. I would say more than in many other countries in Europe that I know of. And it's a very vibrant ecosystem. I would say, though, that in Berlin, we are missing a little bit of the ecosystem building and community feeling that, for example, other countries in Europe have through, for example, Norsken in Sweden or Catapult in Norway. They've been really good at building ecosystems and communities around impact. And here in Berlin, it's a little bit more segmented for now, but I think it's also because it's quite new. And hopefully that will change with all the VCs and startups that are emerging. I would say that the climate community is quite international by now. And you see a lot of communities that, for example, started in the US, like the MCJ community, or Voyagers was, I believe, international by definition from the very beginning. And you see these communities both in Germany and in other countries, instead of the more country-based communities that other, as I said, like players basically started in their own countries or home countries. So it's interesting how impact and climate also, the way that you build communities has been a little bit different.
And the fund you're at now, AENU, talks about VC being broken it talks about itself as an impact venture capitalist. I think you've raised 100 million euros, if I understand correctly as well. Can you tell us a bit about who's behind that? Why is VC broken? What is AENU doing to fix it?
Yeah. So we are a team of 11 people, amazing people based out of Berlin. And the fund was founded initially by Fabian and Ferry Heilemann, who are very successful entrepreneurs here in Germany. They built many companies together. The first one, Daily Deal, they sold to Google 10 years ago by now. And they also built Forto, a unicorn company in the logistics space. And Fabian, he was also a GP at Early Bird, so he had that institutional background and even built the ClimateTech practice there. So they've seen it all. They have very strong entrepreneurial DNA, as well institutional investing, and they decided to come back together and build this beautiful long-term impact organization that is AENU. So that's a little bit about our founding story. But in terms of our more general thesis, we think financial capitalism is broken. It has led to the social inequalities and climate crisis that we see at the moment because externalities are not priced in, and they haven't been priced in for decades, and they are only starting to be priced in now. And we believe that we need a new system that takes into account these externalities. And that system we call impact capitalism, which is not necessarily a new term, but is one that we subscribe to. And that's the basis for what we are building here. And more generally, we think that venture capital is broken for a few reasons. One, it is not accessible for a majority of people. Basically, the people that benefit from venture capital are those that already have the means and the resources to be invested. And especially if we are investing in impacts and in climate, it makes sense also to think about who is participating in the venture capital model. So that's one. Second, we also think that we should be investing in systemic change and not just in very specific technologies that solve narrow problems. So that means looking broader at the stakeholder ecosystem around the problems that we are tackling in climate and in social impact. We should be working, for example, with policymakers and regulators. We should be working with corporates that have pinpoints that these technologies can address. And we should be in constant communication and engagement to make sure that we are solving the right problems. And obviously, venture capital in general has lacked a lot of impact, or it has never been a priority. And we have the opportunity with venture capital as an industry to actually be a force for good and drive that impact that many other asset classes have been driving over the last decades, for example, with ESG investing in public markets. So those are a few of the reasons why we think it's broken, but can be fixed.
But it's also a tall order. I mean, if I look at, if you have 100 million euros under management and you're 11 people, it doesn't leave a lot of time to be working with legislators when you're definitely drinking from the fire hose just to be able to manage the deals and do the deal scouting. So where does it come from? And is it the industry needs to come together? And as you kind of mentioned, as in the case in Berlin, to work together to float all boats? Or are there any endeavors that are taking place right now that can kind of help this? Are you reaching out to the legislators? I totally agree that, by the way, that the legislation is such a key piece of it. And I think there's appetite from legislators and from big corporates, but indeed it's hard to kind of put that desire into action.
Well, we have very big ambitions. And obviously we started with 100 million in assets under management, but that's not going to be the end, right? And obviously, as a startup to a certain degree, right? A startup venture capital, we need to pick our battles, so we need to have a long-term roadmap of what we want to do now versus in the medium term versus in the long term. So yes, you're right. We are not necessarily reaching out to policymakers left and right, but we interact with them in events and in other contexts. Now, I do think that there are already initiatives popping up in the impact and climate ecosystem to bring together stakeholders, starting within the venture capital industry. And one of my favorites actually is the Impact VC community that Big Society Capital set up last year, that brings together not just impact VCs, but also generalist VCs that don't necessarily have a lot of know-how or history in investing in impact, but now have, for example, head of sustainability roles and people and professionals to make sure that not only they are meeting the new regulatory requirements, but also think about aligning their capital with purpose, because they are feeling the pressure from LPs and other stakeholders, right? And that's a tiny example of different stakeholders coming together, but definitely a lot more to do with other stakeholders down the line.
I hear a lot the complaint or the criticism that venture capital, it works on these kind of 5-year cycles with different funds, and so there's lots of pressure for exits or for some kind of an IPO or an acquisition or something like that. Which for some of these more wicked problems, maybe that works pretty well in B2B SaaS, but for some of these more wicked problems that we're trying to manage, like the saving the world, basically, these can take a little bit longer, right? And it might take a little bit longer before there can be kind of a cash out. Are you looking at kind of changing that paradigm as well, of the kind of 5-year exit or the 5-year fund?
That's a very good question. I think that there is already a history of venture capital funds, even outside of impact and climate, that don't necessarily have the 12+2 legal structure that VC funds are known for, especially in deep tech. You see funds that are 15-year terms, for example. You also see climate funds, especially in the US, like Breakthrough Energy Ventures, having 20-year fund structures, also because they are more focused on catalytic impact, meaning funding technologies that other investors might not be ready to fund, or at least that's how they started. They probably have evolved since then. So there is a lot more innovation also when it comes to structuring VC funds to align with the impact objectives. In our case, we are a traditional venture capital fund in that sense, but we do invest in deep tech, we invest in hardware, and we invest in software, so across different technologies. And for us, the important question is, how do we support our startups in meeting the different financing needs that they need in the short, medium, and long term to make sure that they are set up for success? So for example, how do we link them up with project financing, with debt financing, and with grants, especially for very hardware and CapEx intensive businesses, to make sure, again, that they are set up for success. In that sense, we do follow the typical VC return profile of 3 to 7 years to exit. But I do think that as the ecosystem evolves, we'll see more innovation and we'll see more funds adapting their structures to meet sometimes even longer time horizons.
Yeah, I think we'll also start to see in the next few years a lot of appetite from corporates wanting to basically buy some of these companies and basically import them as their innovation arms or some of their own kinds of solutions. So that's definitely hearing from corporates that this is of interest and kind of on the table for them now. You mentioned some of the types of companies that are in your portfolio, deep tech and that ilk. Can you cherry pick a few examples and tell us a little bit about them and what you liked about them that made AENU invest?
Yes, absolutely. So on the deep tech side, for example, we recently invested in a enhanced rock weathering company called AENU out of the UK. And it's a super simple model where they have rocks, so basalt, that they put on agricultural land. And that serves as not only soil carbon sequestration, but also has co-benefits for yields and nitrogen fixation and other benefits. And for me, I love those type of plays and technologies that don't focus just on one factor, on for example, carbon, but take a more holistic approach, if that's possible, with that technology. So AENU is an example of that. An investment that I made recently as well, and in the agriculture space, actually. So two there from agriculture is Agrina. We invested in the Series B with HB Capital recently. And this is not deep tech necessarily, it's more business model innovation and meeting the needs of an important stakeholder like the farmer is, basically helping them transition from traditional agriculture to regenerative agriculture by providing a new revenue line for them through soil carbon credits, but also helping them finance the transition, which is actually one of the key bottlenecks and challenges that farmers have. And so they have a very holistic approach as well, and they are the #1 platform here in Europe. So those two examples are the most recent ones in agriculture, but obviously we have investments in all sectors, from energy to biodiversity to mobility and more.
You've just mentioned that we tend to get stuck on carbon as being sort of the only metric that matters in climate tech, and you've written a few times about the fact that we need to kind of broaden our perspective on that. What kind of problems do we run into when we just look at carbon?
Well, the climate crisis is not just about carbon. And I think one of the big challenges that we are missing, I would say in venture capital, but more generally in society, is the focus on climate adaptation. It's as important to reduce the risk of future harm as it is to reduce current harms. And not just in developing countries, but also in our own countries, when you see floods, for example, in Germany, basically devastating whole fields and more. And so when you focus only on carbon, it's at the end of the day a trade-off. You're making a decision in allocating to a certain problem without looking at the holistic challenge that we have with climate change. So that's one. And second, I think that a lot of the carbon investments that sometimes investors make, they are moonshots at the end of the day that might or might not work. And that's also an opportunity cost for investing in more incremental impact technologies or transitional technologies. And a lot of these moonshots, from a very much life cycle assessment or simple climate positive, climate negative scenario, have a lot of assumptions about in them, and might actually at a scale not be as climate positive as we think they are. And so at the end of the day, investing is an allocation game, and you're making decisions on where you think the highest impact might be. But there is a lot more that should be funded, from climate adaptation to marginal incremental impact.
You mentioned regenerative agriculture. That's also kind of an area looking at the health of soil and finding ways to kind of measure or quantify the value of that, right? I mean, we have less and less arable, fertile soil in the world, and this is becoming really a scarce resource.
And even farther than that, we also should be taking care of our ecosystem. We should be also watching very closely in the next years what's happening with water withdrawals and water scarcity. We should be looking at the intersection of social inequalities and social impact and climate. There is a lot more to climate than carbon. It is only natural that we start with carbon mitigation because it's quantifiable, because it's comparable, and because it's been the focus of the general public narrative. But I think that these days people are thinking a little bit broader. For example, at the intersection of climate education and climate and social impact or education, a lot of people are focusing on the jobs that are needed for the energy transition, the lack of people that are trained to, for example, install solar panels or heat pumps. And this is going to be critical if we want to make sure that the other technologies that are doing climate mitigation are successful in the long term when they become growth companies and big companies. So there are a lot of interdependencies, and we cannot just be focused on one problem alone.
I like to think that climate tech is as much about the humanities as it is about topics like engineering and physics, and especially, everything from anthropology to psychology, philosophy, sociology, and all of these kinds of things. And I know that you're a big proponent of the idea that technology itself is not necessarily the answer. And I laughed when I saw that you called out the tech bros, or the clean tech bros, who kind of believe that technology itself is the answer. What did you mean by when you called them out that this isn't the only answer?
Yeah, this is referencing a New York Times article about climate bros that was published recently, and it made me laugh a lot because on the one hand, I see a little bit of that attitude, or I saw it in the very beginning of the climate trend, where people were trying to just size the opportunity. They were trying to see, how much more prestige or money they can make by doing impact on climate. I think that has changed for the most part, especially in Europe. I think that people are very genuine about aligning their work and their life with the impact that they want to achieve. But it made me laugh because it reminded me a little bit of the typical, stereotype of Silicon Valley tech bro that thinks that he or she can solve all the world's problems and become the mastermind behind everything that we do and that we use. And in reality, technology cannot be that. Technology is just one piece of the equation. And I like thinking that, it's only when we look at the holistic system, the policies, regulatory frameworks, when we look at what corporates are doing, when we are looking at what's happening in education, right? What skill sets and topics are MBA students that then, become the next tech pros actually studying. It's only when we actually pull all those levers across society that we really have a chance to solve the climate problem in a systemic way, rather than just building the next technology that perhaps, maybe, will solve one specific problem within climate. And another thing that made me laugh about that article is that one of the core value propositions, I guess, of climate bros is that they don't like when people have a doom view of the world, when they think that, we are all going to die and therefore, we should not be positive whatsoever. I don't believe that. I think that we need to obviously be realistic and pragmatic about where we are and the fact that we are behind our climate goals as societies in general, and not just here in Germany, not just in Europe. But that doesn't mean that individually we cannot do the right things, whether it's behaviorally, in your daily life or through your work, to change that course, right? And so I don't believe that we have to be doomed or we have to be a tech pro. There is something definitely in the middle.
Regardless of what kind of path we're heading towards, you can choose to spend your time trying to fight climate change or trying to make groceries delivered 2 minutes faster. I heard a good quote that we have the smartest minds all working on the stupidest problems right now, which sometimes in the tech space, not the climate tech space, but just the general tech space, definitely feels like that case. It also makes me think of something, I ran a renewable energy company from 2006 to 2010. And at that time, renewable energy had the same kind of hype that climate tech has now. And I would get all these calls from people in investment banking or consulting who wanted to get into this space because they wanted to do something impactful, and would always ask me if I said at the time, if I took every request up for a coffee or a beer, I'd be the most caffeinated alcoholic in the world. And you could really figure out the ones who really were looking to do something impactful and make a career change, and others that were kind of getting on the bandwagon because it was cool. And it rarely, if you talk to them about career switching, they were all prepared for the salary decrease, of getting in a startup. They'd all kind of prepared themselves for that. But what I found that was a good screen is to tell them that, okay, but you're also going to have to fly economy from now on. And they're like, nope. That was my experience when we had bankers and consultants applying to come and work for us.
Wow. Hopefully that's changing. I think that especially in venture capital and in the impact startup world, you don't need to take a pay cut necessarily to do something good with your time and your life. It is more the case in foundations, in impact philanthropy, in more concessionary type of impact work. But I don't think that's the case in our industry. And not saying that this should be an incentive for more people to come to the industry. I think there are plenty that really want to align their values with their work, even if that means a different setting and different priorities. And it could be not just flying less, it could also be, eating vegetarian or recycling more at the office. There are so many initiatives that whether you're an impact company or not, you can do to align, your values with your daily life.
Yeah, absolutely. We were a startup, so not on the investment side. So, I mean, these were the things they would have to sacrifice regardless of what kind of startup you were going to. But it was always just funny to see the look on their face, or also when they realized that they would have to kind of file their own expenses and not have all this administrative support around them. So you've got a front row seat to some of the most interesting opportunities. Definitely, AENU gets a lot of the best deal flow because you're quite visible and well known and have this pedigree for having some really great founders behind you, funding it and running it. What are you excited about? What's coming through the pike right now that makes you really excited, or that you think could be, I don't know, maybe a problem we're close to solving, or a new field that's opening up?
Yeah, so there are a few trends that everyone is looking at, and there are other trends that I am only looking at. So starting with the ones that everyone is looking at, including obviously AENU, there's a lot happening in home decarbonization. Plays beyond your typical NPAR or solar that install solar panels on top of your roof. But for example, how to use or leverage data from your home, from smart meters and sensors to recommend specific decarbonization actions or technologies that are adapted to your needs, right? So that's one example. A lot happening in home decarbonization and also expanding beyond the big markets. We see a lot of new startups also emerging in Southern Europe. Then we see a lot also more generally in energy, but specifically energy efficiency for industrial processes. So for example, we recently invested in a company called Alchemy that makes sure that the manufacturing process of clinker and cement is less variable, and therefore by definition also emits less CO2 emissions. And that's a very specific case for concrete and clinker, but definitely there are similar needs in other industries like steel production. So that's something also that we are looking into. And more people are looking also into grid management and grid plays within the energy space. Now, what I have been looking at, I've been looking a lot at biodiversity. Obviously, Agrina is one of those cases, but I'm also quite deep into the water space. I think that is probably 1-2 years away from being VC fundable in many cases, because you need a lot of hardware first before you can have also software layers. And obviously VC investors are more inclined to invest in software, but also because many companies that have their water risks and needs, like for example, utilities, have priorities, and usually first priority is energy, second priority, if at all, is water. That might change in the near future, depending on how bad our water system becomes. And you hear Macron, for example, recently saying that water is one of those underserved and issues within climate. So I've been looking a lot at water. And then I've been looking also at more indirect enabling impact plays within climate analytics and insurance. And this is more of a social impact case, perhaps. And that means how to ensure that people and businesses are well covered for the climate risks that are coming, more on the climate adaptation side of things, and how we make sure that we share that risk more efficiently. And I've seen a lot within the climate insurance space, for example, both product insurance and corporate insurance, but also data plays and risk modeling plays that help insurance, for example, have better policies and premiums for natural catastrophes. So that's another area that I've been quite excited about.
Yeah, it's probably the summer that water becomes top of mind in a lot of jurisdictions, unfortunately. Final question. Who is your hero?
Hero, I guess it's a very big word, but one person that is very dear to my heart and has inspired me a lot of being a role model for many years is the person who introduced me to the entire world of impact venture capital. Her name is Cecile Bilious, and many people know her as the mother of impact investing in Israel specifically. So many decades ago, she was the first one who really ventured into the possibility of both making money and making an impact at the same time, which back then was unknown for many people, definitely in Israel, definitely in Europe. And she's been an inspiration because also she's been trying for a few years now to make sure that traditional generalist venture capital funds can also align themselves to more impact. And even those companies are not, as we call, impact natives and can be impact migrants, meaning they can still, for example, release products that are more impact focused or, for example, introduce ESG measures, that they have that top of mind. And that is not either you're an impact fund or an impact startup or a non-impact fund or non-impact startup. And that's, I would say, very inspiring because it's a different level of systemic change, right? You're not in the niche, you're in the mass market. Plus, she's always had inclusion and diversity top of mind, and she's been an inspiration for everything that I've been doing in the impact venture capital world so far. So yeah, definitely Cecile has been and is my hero.
Melina, thank you so much for joining today.
Thank you. A pleasure.
Thanks for listening to another ClimateTech podcast. Please take 5 seconds to send this episode link to a colleague or friend who you think might be interested. Reach out to me anytime at hello@climatetechpod.com. As you can probably tell, this episode was produced, edited, directed, stage managed, boom operated, and everything else by me. Subscribe to hear many more conversations still to come with the world's real climate tech heroes.